darkness, knowledge emerges.
I was conducting routine inventory when the nutrient vats began to churn without cause. It was the third hour of night cycle, when the Manufactorum district fell into its usual mechanical breathing, the dull rhythm of processors cycling, the distant hum of atmospheric regulators, the occasional clang of servitors performing maintenance in the deep sections. I had walked this route for 11 years, documenting the Hive's food production with the same meticulous detachment the Administratum demanded of all its servants. The vats stretched before me in rows that disappeared into darkness, each one a massive cylinder of corroded metal containing the nutrient paste that sustained 12 billion souls. They were supposed to be still at this hour, the mixing cycles completed, the contents settling into the grey sludge that would be processed into ration bricks by morning shift. The servitors stationed along the catwalks should have been motionless, their limited programming requiring no action until the next production sequence. But they were not motionless. I noticed it first in Servitor Unit 447, its augmetic eye rotating in its socket with unusual speed, focusing and refocusing on VAT 23 as if trying to comprehend something its programming had no categories to process. The servitor's flesh components, what little remained of the human it had been, showed tension. Muscles in its remaining organic arm were taut, fingers twitching in patterns that suggested distress rather than malfunction. Then I heard the sound, bubbling. Not the standard processing noise, something else. Something organic. The surface of VAT 23 was moving, roiling with motion that came from within rather than from any mechanical agitation. I approached the observation platform, my data slate clutched in hands that had begun to tremble, and looked down into the vat's contents. The nutrient paste was churning, rising and falling with rhythms that suggested breathing. The surface broke occasionally, releasing bubbles that popped with wet sounds, releasing vapors that smelled wrong, not the usual chemical staleness of processed algae and synthetic proteins, but something sweet and metallic, like blood left too long in warm air. I activated my Vox bead, contacting the night supervisor. "This is Inventory Coordinator Hadris, Station 7 Kappa. I'm observing irregular activity in VAT 23. Request immediate assessment by Tech Adept. Static." Then a voice heavy with the exhaustion of someone who had processed too many crisis reports in a career spanning decades. "Define irregular activity. Coordinator. The contents are moving independently of processing cycles. Servitor Unit 447 appears. Distressed. The smell is... Servitors do not experience distress, Coordinator. They experience malfunction. Document the observations and file standard maintenance request. Continue your inventory." The Vox clicked off before I could respond. Standard protocol. Everything was always reducible to standard protocol, to forms that could be stamped and filed and forgotten. The Administratum's primary function was not solving problems but documenting them, creating paper trails that would allow blame to be properly assigned when the inevitable failures occurred. I began documenting. Temperature readings, visual observations, atmospheric composition samples. My stylus scratched across parchment with the mechanical precision I had cultivated over years of service, even as my instincts screamed that what I witnessed required action rather than paperwork. The churning intensified, VAT 23's contents rose visibly, swelling against the container's upper limits. I watched the volume increase 0.3 meters in 5 minutes, impossible by any known process. The nutrient paste was not just moving, it was growing. More servitors began to react. Along the entire production line, their augmetic components whirred and clicked as they turned toward the vats, their limited programming overwhelmed by stimuli they lacked frameworks to process. Some simply froze, caught in loops of conflicting directives. Others began emitting sounds, not the standard vox tones used for communication, but something closer to distress calls, mechanical keening that suggested their organic components were experiencing something their masters had assumed they were incapable of feeling: fear. By the time dawn cycle illumination activated, every vat in Section 7 Kappa showed the same phenomenon. The nutrient paste had doubled in volume, pressing against container walls with force that caused the metal to groan. The smell had intensified, permeating the entire sector with its predatory sweetness. It coated the inside of my mouth with each breath, tasting like copper and rot and something else. I could not name something that made my body want to reject it, even as some deeper part of my nervous system recognized it as familiar. The day shift personnel arrived to find me standing on the observation platform, my data slate filled with measurements that made no logical sense, my face gray with the exhaustion of witnessing something that should not exist. Senior Administratum Clerk Vollen reviewed my documentation with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent 40 years reducing reality to acceptable categories. He read each page, his augmetic eye scanning the data, while his organic eye remained fixed on the forms themselves, as if the parchment were more real than what they described. "Processing anomaly," he announced finally. His voice carried the flat certainty of someone who had decided on an explanation and would accept no contradiction, likely caused by temperature fluctuations in the base nutrient stock. Perhaps contamination from the ventilation systems. The tech priests will be notified. Production will continue with acceptable variance parameters. "The volume has doubled," I said. "The servitors are malfunctioning across all units. The smell is irrelevant to nutritional content pending chemical analysis." He stamped my report with the seal of official acknowledgement, the wax pressing into parchment with finality. "You have documented appropriately, Coordinator Hadris. Your diligence is noted. Return to your assigned duties." But his hands shook as he stamped. I saw it clearly, the tremor that ran through his augmetic fingers, the way his organic hand gripped the desk edge as if requiring support. He knew. On some level, the Administratum's conditioning could not fully suppress. He understood that this was not a processing anomaly, not a simple contamination, not something that could be resolved through standard protocols. He knew, as I knew, that something alive was growing where only sustenance should exist. I left his office and returned to the production floor. The morning shift had begun, workers filing into their stations to begin the day's processing. They moved through the familiar routines, but I saw the way they glanced at the vats, saw the unconscious movements they made to maintain distance from the containers, saw the expressions that suggested their instincts recognized threat, even if their conscious minds had not yet processed it. The nutrient paste continued to churn, continued to grow, continued to emit that sweet, metallic smell that spoke of appetite rather than nutrition. And the servitors stood frozen at their stations, their augmetic eyes fixed on the vats, their organic components trembling with responses that should have been impossible for creatures whose humanity had been surgically excised. I felt it then, the first touch of true horror. Not fear of immediate danger, but the deeper terror that comes from recognizing that the foundations of existence have shifted, that the basic assumptions upon which survival depends have been invalidated. The hive's food supply was not inert matter being processed according to established protocols. It was becoming something else, something that moved with purpose, something that smelled like a predator. And we, 12 billion souls dependent on that food for survival, were trapped in a structure kilometers high and deep, with nowhere to flee, no escape except through starvation or through consuming what the vats now contained. I returned to my inventory station and continued my documentation, because the Administratum demanded it, because routine provided the illusion of control, because acknowledging the full implications of what I had witnessed would require confronting a truth too terrible to process. But deep in the facility, beneath our feet and above our heads, in thousands of vats containing enough nutrient paste to sustain the entire hive, something was growing, something was waking. Something was hungry, and we had fed it everything we had. The first distribution began at dawn, as it had every day for centuries. I stood at my station in Distribution Hub Gamma 9, surrounded by the familiar machinery of survival conveyor belts that carried sealed ration bricks from processing to transport, sorting servitors that categorized them by nutritional grade and destination sector, workers who loaded them into crates for delivery throughout the hive. The routine was absolute, unchanged, sacred in its repetition, but today the ration bricks were wrong. I noticed it immediately when the first batch arrived from the processing facility. The standard packaging grey plastic sealed with wax stamps bearing the Administratum's approval marks looked normal at first glance, but as they passed under the sorting lumen strips, I saw something that made my stomach clench. They were moving, not obviously. Not in ways that would trigger immediate alarm, just subtle shifts, barely perceptible bulges beneath the plastic, as if the contents were settling under their own weight. Except ration bricks did not settle. They were compressed nutrient paste, solidified through processing into blocks so dense they could survive decades of storage without degradation. These were not settling. These were breathing. I reached out to inspect one, standard procedure for quality verification. The moment my fingers made contact, the brick pulsed. A single throb, like touching living muscle, transmitted through the plastic and into my skin. I jerked my hand back, heart hammering, and stared at the ration as it continued down the conveyor belt toward the loading bay. Coordinator Hadris called Worker Secundus Krell from the loading station. "We have a situation." I walked to his station, passing other workers who had paused in their duties, all of them staring at the rations with expressions that ranged from confusion to barely suppressed horror. Krell stood beside an opened crate, one hand still gripping the ration brick he had been about to stack, the other covering his mouth. The ration had split open. Not from impact or mishandling, it had opened itself, the plastic wrapper torn from within. And what I saw inside made my training, my years of documentation and clinical detachment, collapse into primal revulsion. Fibers. Thread-like structures that were not quite plant and not quite animal, woven through the nutrient paste in patterns that suggested organization rather than random contamination. They twitched, contracted and relaxed with visible rhythm. Muscle fibers. Living tissue growing in food that should have been sterile, processed, dead. "Don't touch it," I said, though Krell had already dropped the ration and backed away. "Don't touch any of them. Halt distribution immediately." But I was too late. The Vox horns activated throughout the distribution hub, announcing the morning's ration release to the waiting population centers. Thousands of civilians would already be queuing at the dispensation points, clutching their allocation chits, waiting for the food that kept them alive for another day. And we were sending them this. I activated my Vox bead, connecting to the hub's overseer. "This is Coordinator Hadris. We need to stop distribution. The rations are contaminated. They're contaminated how?" The overseer's voice carried the bureaucratic impatience of someone managing 1,000 crises simultaneously. "Define contamination parameters. They're alive. The contents are moving. There are organic structures that shouldn't exist in processed. Coordinator, we have 12 million people waiting for morning rations across 17 sectors. Do you understand what happens if we halt distribution without proper authorization? Riots, stampedes, mass casualties from panic alone. Unless you can provide specific chemical analysis proving the food is toxic, distribution proceeds according to schedule. But document your observations. Submit them through proper channels. Distribution proceeds." The Vox cut off. Around me, the conveyor belts continued their mechanical rhythm, carrying thousands of ration bricks toward loading bays, toward transport vehicles, toward distribution points where hungry citizens waited with the patient desperation of those who knew that missing their allocation meant starvation. I watched them go, these things that pulsed with alien life, and felt complicity settle over me like ash. I was part of the system, part of the machinery that would feed corrupted sustenance to millions, because halting the process required authorization I did not possess, because the Administratum valued order over safety, because admitting the food supply had failed was more terrifying than distributing poison. The first screams reached us within the hour. They came through the Vox network, transmitted from distribution point Secundus in the lower hab blocks. Not organized reports, just raw audio, the sounds of panic and horror bleeding through communication channels. I heard civilians screaming, heard enforcers shouting commands, heard something else, wet tearing sounds, like fabric ripping, except the fabric was plastic, and what tore through it should not have possessed the strength. Rations are opening on their own. Civilians refuse to accept them, requesting crowd control. Multiple injuries, something in the food is moving. The transmission dissolved into static, then screaming, then silence. More reports flooded in from other distribution points. The pattern was consistent rations splitting open when touched by human hands, as if they sensed living warmth and responded to it. The fibers inside were becoming more active, more aggressive. Some civilians had already bitten into their portions before noticing the contamination. Their reactions were being documented in Medicae reports that arrived in fragmented bursts. Violent nausea, convulsions, respiratory distress, and something else, descriptions that the Medicae staff seemed reluctant to fully articulate. Phrases like subcutaneous movement and tissue reorganization that suggested the contamination was not just poisoning its victims, but changing them. The enforcers tried to maintain order. I watched through the hub's surveillance feeds as armored personnel attempted to confiscate the rations, to prevent distribution, to impose quarantine on areas where contamination had already occurred. But the crowds were desperate, starving, conditioned by lifetimes of scarcity to believe that any food was better than none. Some civilians fought for their rations, grappled with enforcers over bricks that throbbed and leaked fluids that were not supposed to exist in processed nutrient paste. Some succeeded in consuming them despite warnings, swallowing chunks of contaminated matter with the mechanical efficiency of those who had learned not to question what kept them alive. I watched one man on the surveillance feed, older, gaunt, clutching a ration brick that visibly pulsed in his hands. An enforcer shouted warnings, raised a shock maul in threat. The man ignored him, bit into the ration with desperate hunger, chewed and swallowed even as the brick split further open, even as the fibers inside writhed like parasites seeking hosts. He finished eating, stood there for a moment, confused by the enforcer's continued aggression. Then his face changed. Not dramatically, just a subtle shift in expression, a look of surprise that transformed into horror as he realized something was wrong inside him. He vomited, but what came up was not food. It was more fibers, more of whatever had grown in the rations, now growing in him, erupting from his throat in masses that should not have fit through human anatomy. He collapsed, body convulsing, and the surveillance feed cut away as the enforcers moved in. By midday, the distribution hub had descended into controlled chaos. We were receiving rations back from collection points, contaminated bricks that civilians had refused, that enforcers had confiscated, that transport workers had abandoned when they saw what they contained. They arrived in crates that bulged outward, their contents swelling beyond original volume, pressing against packaging that was never designed to contain living matter. One crate split open as servitors attempted to move it. Rations spilled across the floor, their plastic wrappers dissolving as if being digested, their contents merging into a single spreading mass. The fibers had grown, multiplied, woven themselves into something that looked less like contaminated food and more like tissue, like organs, like the beginnings of something that was learning to be alive. When smashed, they bled, not nutrient paste leaking. Blood. Actual blood, dark, thick. Wrong in its consistency but unmistakably organic fluid designed to carry oxygen and nutrients through living systems. It pooled on the ferrocrete floor, and where it spread, I saw movement, microscopic perhaps, but visible if you looked closely. The blood itself was alive. I filed incident reports until my fingers cramped. Each document was a confession, an admission that we had lost control, that the Hive's food supply had transformed into something hostile. I stamped forms with hands that shook, watched them pile into mountains of paperwork that would be processed through bureaucratic channels while people died eating corrupted sustenance. The Administratum sent its response by evening. Continue limited distribution of uncontaminated stock while contaminated batches undergo assessment. Maintain order, document all deviations, the Emperor protects. But there was no uncontaminated stock. Every vat, every processing line, every storage facility showed the same transformation. The corruption was total, pervasive, accelerating. And we were still sending food to distribution points because the alternative, admitting we could not feed the Hive, would cause collapse more immediate than contamination. That night, I stood in the distribution hub, surrounded by crates of rations that pulsed with alien life, listening to Vox reports of riots and sickness and deaths, and I understood what we had become. Not victims of some external attack, not casualties of war or invasion. We were breeders, cultivators. We had spent centuries processing nutrients to sustain human life, and something had learned to use that same infrastructure to sustain itself instead. The Hive's food supply was no longer feeding us, it was feeding on us. And panic, I realized, was no longer something to prevent. It was something inevitable, building like pressure in sealed containers, waiting for the moment when reality could no longer be denied. And 12 billion souls understood simultaneously that they would starve or eat poison, that there was no third option, that the Imperium's promise of sustenance had transformed into a choice between methods of death. The rations watched back from their containers, pulsing with rhythms that mimicked heartbeats, and I knew the screaming had only just begun. The quarantine protocols activated on the third day, when even the Administratum could no longer pretend control existed. I received the notification through standard channels, a data slate delivered by courier whose face was covered with a rebreather, whose eyes showed the hollow exhaustion of someone who had witnessed too much in too short a time. The orders were succinct, stamped with emergency seals that superseded normal bureaucratic processes. All personnel assigned to storage districts 7 Kappa through 12 Sigma are hereby confined to their duty stations pending contamination assessment. Bulkhead seals will engage at 0600 hours. Atmospheric separation protocols in effect. Duration, indefinite. Compliance is mandatory. The Emperor protects. Indefinite. The word carried the weight of a death sentence phrased in bureaucratic language. We were being sealed inside with the contamination, isolated from the rest of the hive, written off as acceptable losses, while the Administratum maintained the fiction that barriers could contain what had already spread beyond containment. The bulkheads came down with the grinding finality of tombs closing. Massive plates of reinforced ceramite, designed to compartmentalize the hive in case of fire or structural failure, descended from ceiling mounts and locked into floor housings with magnetic seals that hummed with power. The sound echoed through the storage districts, a deep, resonant boom that marked the moment when we ceased being personnel and became quarantined subjects. I stood in my assigned sector, watching the bulkhead seal off the primary corridor, and felt the air pressure shift as atmospheric separation engaged. We were now breathing recycled air processed through filters that were supposed to remove contaminants, that were supposed to protect us from whatever had transformed the food supply. But protection was already a lie. I heard it first in the ventilation shafts, sounds that should not exist in atmospheric processing systems, skittering. Not mechanical, not the expected clicking of maintenance servitors or the rattle of loose components. This was organic, rapid, deliberate. Something was moving through the ducts with purpose, navigating the hive's infrastructure with intelligence that suggested it understood where it was going. The other workers heard it too. We stood at our stations, duties forgotten, heads tilted upward toward the ceiling panels that concealed the ventilation network. The skittering grew louder, multiplied, became a chorus of movement that suggested not a single thing but many, coordinated, spreading through passages too narrow for human bodies. Then came the tearing sounds, soft at first like cloth being slowly ripped or flesh separating from bone. They emanated from behind, sealed bulkheads, from storage chambers that had been locked down, from sections of the district that surveillance had gone dark in. The tearing was methodical, patient, the sound of something working through obstacles with neither frustration nor urgency. Just persistence. Worker Tertius Malin was the first to break. He ran for the sealed bulkhead, pounding on the ceramite with fists that left bloody smears, screaming for release in a voice that cracked with panic. "Let us out. It's in the walls. It's in the fucking walls. We're going to die in here." The enforcers stationed inside the quarantine zone tried to restrain him. One raised a shock mole in warning. But before he could strike, Malin collapsed, clutching his stomach, his face contorting in agony that went beyond fear. His abdomen moved. Not the normal motion of breathing or muscle spasm. This was something else, visible displacement of tissue, as if objects were shifting position inside his body cavity. Lumps formed and traveled beneath his skin, pressing outward against flesh that bulged but did not tear. He had eaten the rations 3 days ago, before the contamination became obvious, before the warnings were issued. He had consumed his allocated portion like we all had, like the hive's population had been doing for decades without question. And now whatever had been in that food was growing inside him. The Medicae teams arrived within minutes, their hazard suits hissing with pressurized seals, their equipment gleaming with the sterile precision of those who believed protocol could impose order on biology. They surrounded Malin, scanning him with Auspex devices that clicked and whirred, that produced readings I could not interpret, but whose implications were clear from the Medicae's body language. Terror. Carefully controlled, professionally concealed, but unmistakable to anyone who knew how to read the tension in shoulders, the hesitation in movements, the way eyes kept darting toward exits that no longer existed. Subcutaneous anomalies detected. One Medicae reported into his Vox multiple sites of organized tissue that does not match subject's genetic profile, recommending immediate surgical extraction. But before they could move him to the medical station, Malin screamed again. His skin split, not torn from outside but opened from within, precise incisions that suggested intelligence rather than random damage, and through the openings emerged fibers. The same thread-like structures we had seen in the rations, but larger now, thicker, moving with coordinated purpose. They were not simply growing in him, they were using him. His body had become substrate, raw material being converted into something else, something that needed organic matter to construct itself. The Medicae backed away. One dropped his auspex, the device clattering on ferrocrete as he stumbled toward the far wall. Another began muttering prayers, not the standard Imperial litanies, but something older, desperate words in a dialect I did not recognize. Malin stopped screaming. His eyes were still open, still conscious, but his expression had changed. Not pain anymore. Something else. Confusion, perhaps. Or the terrible awareness of experiencing transformation from inside, of feeling yourself become something other than what you were while your consciousness remained intact to witness it. More workers began to collapse over the following hours. Not all of them, perhaps 1 in 10, suggesting the contamination's effects were not universal, that some aspect of individual biology provided resistance or made certain people more suitable hosts. But enough. Enough that the quarantine zone's medical capacity was overwhelmed within the first day. Enough that we ran out of restraints and isolation chambers, and eventually stopped trying to contain those who showed symptoms. They were left where they fell, bodies convulsing, skin splitting to release growths that spread across the floor in patterns that hurt to perceive directly. The Medicae documented what they could before their equipment began to malfunction, Auspex units producing corrupted data, picked capture devices showing images that did not match what the eye saw, cogitators crashing when attempting to process biological readings that violated their programming parameters. The adepts were summoned. Tech priests in red robes, their augmetic components whirring with sacred rites, their flesh components reduced to minimal necessity. They approached the contamination sites with incense and data tethers, seeking communion with machine spirits, invoking the Omnissiah's wisdom. The cogitators responded with runes that should not exist in Imperial Gothic, symbols that predated human language, that suggested meanings the tech priests' conditioning had not prepared them for. One adept's cranial implants sparked and died, his cybernetic components failing simultaneously as if rejecting what they had been commanded to process. He removed his helmet, a breach of protocol so severe it suggested his sanity had fractured, and spoke in a voice thick with static and biological distortion. The machine spirits see nothing. They report. Void. Absence. As if the contamination exists outside parameters that can be measured or categorized. It is not corruption, not mutation. It is. He paused, his augmetic eye rotating wildly. It is digestion. The hive is being digested from within. Then he collapsed, his remaining organic components seizing, his augmetics going dark. I felt it then, really felt it for the first time, not fear or horror but deeper existential terror, the understanding that we were not fighting an invasion or infection, we were experiencing predation. Something had entered the hive's food supply and was now using that infrastructure to consume us, to break down human bodies and imperial structures into component materials that could be repurposed. The hive itself was the prey. And we, its inhabitants, were simply nutrients waiting to be processed. The walls groaned, not from structural stress, from something else. I pressed my hand against the ferrocrete and felt it pulse, felt warmth that should not exist in inorganic material, felt texture changing beneath my palm, becoming softer, more yielding, as if the stone itself were being converted into flesh. The ventilation shafts released sounds that were no longer mechanical. Breathing. Wet, organic breathing transmitted through ducts that were supposed to carry only air, and with each exhalation came spores, microscopic particles that sparkled in the lumen strip's light, that landed on skin and clothing and exposed surfaces, that began their work immediately upon contact. The quarantine had come too late, not by hours or days, but by the fundamental impossibility of containing something that moved through infrastructure we depended on for survival. You cannot seal off air, cannot isolate yourself from ventilation systems, cannot live without breathing, and every breath carried contamination deeper into lungs, into bloodstreams, into cells that would be rewritten according to imperatives we could not comprehend. I covered my mouth with my sleeve, useless gesture, symbolic resistance, and tasted rot and sweetness despite the fabric. The air itself had changed composition, had been processed through biomass that added components the atmospheric regulators were never designed to filter. Behind sealed bulkheads, I heard screaming, heard metal tearing, heard the soft collapse of structures that should have been solid. The contamination was spreading not despite the quarantine, but because of it. The sealed sections had become isolated environments where it could grow without interference, could reach critical mass before breaking through barriers that had been designed to contain fires and decompression, not living matter that learned and adapted. I felt the floor shift beneath my feet, not tremors from machinery or distant collapses. The floor itself was moving, pulsing. The ferrocrete had been compromised, infiltrated by growth that converted stone into something halfway between mineral and tissue. The hive was changing, being digested, transformed from human construction into alien architecture according to principles that existed beyond imperial engineering. And we, trapped in the quarantine zones, could only watch and document and wait for the moment when the transformation reached us, when our bodies would join the biomass, when individual existence would dissolve into the greater organism that the hive was becoming. The quarantine had come too late. We had been inside the predator's stomach from the moment the vats changed. We just hadn't realized we were already being digested. Hunger drove them to eat, despite the warnings. By the 5th day, the hive's rationing system had collapsed completely. No new food was being produced. The processing facilities had been consumed by the contamination, their machinery transformed into organic structures that pulsed with alien purpose. The stored rations were either corrupted or locked behind quarantine zones that no one dared breach. 12 billion people, no food, panic spreading faster than any contagion. I watched it begin through the surveillance feeds that still functioned, through the reports that continued to filter in despite the chaos. The desperate descended first, the already starving populations of the lower hives, the underfed workers whose caloric intake had always been calculated to the minimum necessary for survival. They had no reserves, no cushion between sustenance and death. They broke into the sealed storage chambers. I heard them through the bulkheads, the sound of cutting torches working through ceramite, the thud of improvised battering rams, the screaming of crowds that had transformed from orderly queues into mobs driven by hunger that overrode every other instinct. The enforcers tried to stop them, fired warning shots that became lethal shots when the crowds would not disperse. But you cannot shoot hunger, cannot intimidate starvation. The mobs absorbed casualties and kept coming, waves of desperate humanity that crashed against barriers until the barriers broke or the enforcers' ammunition ran out. The first breach occurred in Storage District 9 Theta. I was monitoring the feeds when the bulkhead gave way, when hundreds of starving civilians poured through the opening into chambers where contaminated rations waited in stacks that reached the ceiling. They fell upon the food with animal desperation, tearing open plastic wrappers, stuffing chunks of corrupted nutrient paste into mouths that were too hungry to question, too desperate to care. I wanted to look away, wanted to cut the feed. But the Administratum required documentation, and documentation required witnesses, and I had been trained to watch without flinching, to record without intervening. So I watched them eat. Watched them consume rations that visibly moved in their hands, that bled when bitten, that contained fibers that writhed like worms seeking hosts. I watched them swallow, watched relief flood their faces as their stomachs filled for the first time in days. Then I watched them die. Not immediately. That would have been mercy. Instead, the transformation began within minutes. The first man to show symptoms clutched his throat, eyes wide with confusion rather than pain. His neck bulged, deformed, as if something inside were pushing outward against flesh and cartilage. He tried to scream, but what emerged was not sound, just a wet gurgling as his airway filled with growth that should not exist. He fell, convulsed. His body arched backward at angles that suggested his spine was being restructured, that bones were breaking and reforming according to new architectural principles. His skin rippled with movement beneath, with shapes that pressed outward, creating temporary protrusions before sinking back into the mass. The others backed away from him, horror momentarily overriding hunger, but they had already eaten, already introduced the contamination into their bodies, already initiated the process that would transform them from humans into substrate for something else. They began to fall. One by one at first, then in groups, then in waves as the contamination reached critical concentration in their systems. The storage chamber became a scene of mass convulsion, hundreds of bodies writhing on the floor in synchronized agony that suggested they were no longer experiencing individual suffering but collective transformation. Their screams echoed through the ventilation system, transmitted into every quarantine zone, impossible to block or silence. Not screams of pain, those were almost bearable. These were screams of realization, of conscious minds experiencing their own dissolution, of awareness persisting while bodies betrayed every definition of human form. I watched one woman young, perhaps 20 years standard, as her abdomen swelled to impossible size in seconds, not pregnancy, not any natural process. Her skin became translucent, revealing masses of fiber and tissue growing inside her with visible speed, consuming her organs, replacing them with structures that served purposes I could not guess. Her screaming stopped when her jaw dislocated, when her mouth opened wider than human anatomy permitted, when something emerged from her throat, not expelled but extending, a growth that unfolded like a flower blooming, covered in mucus and blood and fluids that were neither. She looked at me, or at the surveillance lens. Her eyes were still human, still aware, still screaming silently while her body completed its transformation into something that would never be recognized as having been human. Then she exploded. Not from internal pressure, from purpose. Her body ruptured in a controlled fashion, releasing clouds of spores that filled the storage chamber with glittering particles that caught the lumen strip's light. The spores drifted with unnatural slowness, settling on surfaces, on exposed skin, on the other victims who were still in the process of transformation, accelerating it, spreading it. Each ruptured body became a vector for further contamination, releasing spores that would find new hosts, that would continue the cycle of consumption and transformation. Within an hour, the storage chamber was silent. Nothing moved except the slow rippling of biomass that covered every surface, that had consumed the bodies and the rations and the ferrocrete itself, merging everything into a single organic mass that pulsed with rhythms that suggested something learning, adapting, growing toward purposes only it understood. But the breaches continued. In other districts, other storage facilities, the pattern repeated: mobs driven by starvation, barriers breaking, desperate consumption, transformation, rupture, spread. Each cycle adding biomass to the growing organism, each wave of victims becoming raw material for further expansion. The Vox network transmitted reports from across the Hive. Sectors falling silent. Entire districts reporting atmospheric contamination. Medicae facilities overwhelmed by victims whose symptoms defied treatment. And always, the sound of screaming human voices experiencing transformation, calling out for help that would not come, for mercy that did not exist. Some tried to resist, tried to survive on stored water and whatever scraps could be scavenged from locations the contamination had not reached. But hunger is patient, hunger is inevitable. The human body can survive perhaps 30 days without food, less if already malnourished, less still if engaging in the physical labor required to exist in a hive city, and 30 days was far longer than the contamination needed. It spread through the ventilation systems, through the water recycling facilities, through every shared infrastructure that connected one part of the hive to another. Avoiding contaminated food was possible. Avoiding contaminated air and water was not. I documented each report, each casualty estimate, each sector that went dark. The numbers grew beyond comprehension. Thousands became millions. Millions became projections that suggested total hive population would be affected within weeks. My stylus scratched across parchment with mechanical precision while my mind recoiled from what the numbers represented. Not statistics, people. Billions of individual consciousnesses experiencing transformation, feeling themselves dissolve into biomass, dying while remaining aware that death was preferable to what they were becoming. The enforcers who had tried to maintain order began to fall. Not from violence, from consumption. They had eaten their rations like everyone else, had consumed contaminated food before the warnings, before the quarantine, before anyone understood what was happening. Their transformations were documented in picked captures that would become evidence in inquiries that would never happen, in investigations that assumed there would be survivors to conduct them. I watched an enforcer's armor split open from within, the ceramite buckling as growth pushed outward with force that exceeded the material's tensile strength. The man inside was still alive, still conscious, his augmetic components fused with organic matter in ways that suggested the contamination could adapt to and incorporate even mechanical systems. His Vox unit continued to transmit for hours after his transformation should have killed him. It broadcast sounds that were not quite language, patterns of static and wet clicking that might have been attempts at communication, or might have been the audio signature of something using vocal cords for purposes they were never designed for. Then silence. Then the sound of his armor being broken down, digested, its components separated into base elements that would be repurposed. Nothing was wasted, everything was consumed. The contamination was terrifyingly efficient, converting human bodies and imperial construction into biomass with minimal energy loss, with optimization that suggested evolutionary refinement across countless worlds, countless populations, countless species that had become fuel for expansion. By the 7th day, the quarantine zones showed signs of structural failure, not from damage from transformation. The walls were changing, becoming softer, more organic. Support pillars developed textures that resembled muscle tissue. Floors became yielding, warm, pulsing with circulation systems that had not existed in the original architecture. The hive was being eaten, digested, transformed from human construction into alien organism, and we, trapped inside, were simply nutrients awaiting processing. I felt it in my own body, subtle changes, the beginning stages, a persistent hunger that food did not satisfy, a strange warmth in my core, occasional muscle spasms that suggested my nervous system was being rewritten. I had breathed contaminated air for days, had touched surfaces covered in spores, had consumed water that passed through processing systems the contamination had infiltrated. I was infected. We all were. The only variables were time frame and severity, not whether transformation would occur. I continued documenting because it was all I knew how to do, because the alternative was confronting the certainty of my own dissolution, because maintaining routine provided the illusion that meaning still existed. But the screaming continued. From every direction. From victims in distant sectors and nearby chambers, and inside my own quarantine zone, the sound of humanity being processed, being broken down, being consumed by something that saw flesh not as life but as raw material, feeding on the starving, growing stronger with each victim, learning with each transformation, and we had fed it billions. The emergency broadcast activated on the 10th day, and I knew immediately it would be the last. The vox horns crackled to life across what remained of the hive's communication network, their activation cutting through the constant background noise of screaming and tearing metal and wet organic sounds that had become our new soundscape. Every functional receiver picked up the signal, a priority override that commandeered every channel, every frequency, every device capable of audio output. The voice that emerged was Governor Malthius himself. I recognized it from the countless ceremonial broadcasts I had processed over the years that practiced tone of authority, that careful modulation designed to project confidence and control, but now it carried undertones that training could not fully conceal. Exhaustion. Fear. The vocal tremor of someone delivering words they did not believe. "Citizens of Hive Primus," he began, and I heard the pause where he had edited out something, perhaps a cough, perhaps a moment where his composure faltered. "The current crisis affecting our food distribution systems has been contained through the Emperor's grace and the tireless work of our defense forces. Quarantine protocols have successfully isolated contaminated sectors. Purification rites are underway. Alternative nutrition sources are being processed and will reach distribution points within 48 hours. Lies. Every word a carefully constructed fiction designed to prevent the panic that had already consumed the hive. The situation is under control." he continued, and I wondered if he could hear his own words echoing through corridors filled with biomass, through sectors where walls breathed and floors pulsed with alien circulation. Remain in your designated residential zones. Do not attempt to breach quarantine barriers. Do not consume unauthorized food sources. Maintain faith in the God Emperor's protection. Order will be restored. The transmission should have ended there. Standard emergency protocol dictated brief, authoritative statements that projected confidence without providing details that might cause alarm. But it continued, and I realized I was hearing something unprecedented. The governor was still speaking, but the words were different now. Not the prepared statement, but something else, something raw and unfiltered. Can't stop it. The entire lower hive is gone. The walls are bleeding. We've lost contact with 47 sectors. The astropathic choir tried to send for help, but something interfered with the transmission there. Nick. Screaming, they won't stop screaming. The medici says, I'm infected, says we're all infected, that it's in the air, in the water, in everything we've touched. Then another voice, sharp with panic. My lord, you're still broadcasting. A struggle. Sounds of physical confrontation, the Vox unit being wrestled away from someone who had broken, who had decided in a moment of desperate honesty to tell the truth rather than maintain the lie. Then silence. Then the Vox horns deactivating with a click that felt like a door closing on the last pretense of governmental authority. I stood in my monitoring station, surrounded by other coordinators and clerks who had heard the same broadcast, who understood with sudden terrible clarity that if the governor himself had fractured, if the highest authority in the hive had abandoned the fiction of control, then there was no authority left, no hierarchy, no system of governance that retained meaning. The Administratum's last lie had been exposed, not by revelation but by its speaker's collapse into truth. Around me, my fellow administrators reacted in ways that suggested their conditioning was also failing. Some wept openly, a display of emotion so prohibited in Administratum culture that witnessing it felt like watching reality itself crack. Some began destroying their documentation, tearing parchment and smashing data slates as if eliminating records could somehow unmake what had happened. Senior Clerk Volin sat at his desk, hands folded with perfect composure, and spoke in a voice utterly devoid of inflection. We should continue our duties. Documentation must be maintained. The situation requires proper filing procedures to ensure accurate historical record for... He stopped, looked down at his hands, watched them shake despite his augmetic component stabilization systems. Then he stood, walked calmly to the viewing port that overlooked the processing district, and stared at the scene below. I joined him. Looked out at what had been an orderly industrial sector and was now something else entirely. The contamination had reached critical mass. The biomass was no longer spreading. It had spread, had consumed everything within reach, and was now consolidating, organizing, transforming from scattered growths into something unified. The entire district pulsed with synchronized rhythm, every surface moving in coordination that suggested central control, collective purpose. Structures that had been buildings were now organs. Corridors had become arteries. The ferrocrete foundations had been converted into something like bone-rigid support systems for flesh that grew around and through them. And everywhere, the movement continued growth, consolidation, adaptation towards some final configuration only the organism understood. It's beautiful, Volin whispered. Not with admiration, with the broken wonder of someone whose mind had finally surrendered to incomprehensibility. We spent centuries building this hive, generations of human labor and imperial engineering, and it's being improved, optimized, made more efficient than we ever managed. I looked at him sharply. His augmetic eye had ceased functioning, the lens cracked and dark, but his organic eye gleamed with something worse than madness, with understanding, with the terrible clarity that comes from accepting truth that destroys the foundations of existence. We're not being destroyed, he continued. We're being incorporated, added to something larger. Our biomass, our infrastructure, our entire civilization rendered down and rebuilt according to principles that exceed our comprehension. It's not evil, it's just more efficient than humanity. Then he climbed onto the viewing port's ledge, a narrow maintenance walkway with no safety barriers, and stepped off. I did not watch him fall. turned away before his body struck the biomass 20 meters below, before I could witness whether the organism consumed him immediately or whether his death served no purpose, and he was simply left to rot among the other discarded components. Behind me, I heard others making similar choices. The sound of bodies hitting surfaces, the wet impact of flesh meeting transformed floors that had developed yielding, almost cushioning properties. Not suicide as protest or despair, suicide as logical conclusion, as the rational response to certainty that transformation was inevitable and painful, that choosing the method and timing of death was the last remaining autonomy. I did not join them. Not from courage, from stubborn, irrational commitment to documentation, to the belief that recording these final days might somehow matter, that bearing witness retained meaning even when there was no one left to receive the testimony. The Administratum complex where I worked began to fail, not from lack of maintenance, from active transformation. I watched as senior officials barricaded themselves in their offices, as if doors could provide protection from contamination that traveled through air ducts and power conduits and the very walls themselves. I heard arguments through closed doors, debates about evacuation protocols and emergency procedures that assumed there were safe zones to evacuate to, authorities to report to, systems of governance that still functioned. But the Vox network was silent, except for automated warnings that cycled endlessly through emergency protocols no one was implementing. The surveillance feeds showed sectors empty except for biomass. The transportation systems had ceased operating not from mechanical failure, but from biological takeover. The tunnels and rails transformed into arteries that served different purposes now. One senior coordinator, I did not recognize her. Her designation marks obscured by grime and dried blood broke into the records vault. She emerged carrying an armload of parchments, centuries of documentation, files that represented the Hive's entire administrative history. She carried them to an incinerator and fed them into flames, watched them burn with an expression of profound satisfaction. "No record," she said to no one in particular, her voice carrying the sing-song quality of fractured sanity. "No history, no evidence we existed. Better that way. Better to be forgotten than to have this documented as our legacy, that we fed ourselves to something that saw us as nothing but nutrients." The floor beneath my feet pulsed. I felt it through my boots, the steady rhythm of circulation, of the Hive's transformed infrastructure functioning according to alien biology. The sensation was no longer alarming. It had become normal, constant, the new baseline against which all other sensory input was measured. I realized then that I was adapting, that my nervous system was learning to process the contamination's presence as acceptable, as part of the environment rather than threat, that my consciousness was being slowly rewritten to accommodate reality that should have been rejected as impossible. The infection was not just physical, it was psychological. It operated at levels deeper than flesh, rewiring perception itself to make the transformation bearable, to prevent the complete psychological collapse that would occur if the mind fully acknowledged what was happening. We were being digested, and our minds were being adjusted to accept digestion as natural. The emergency lighting failed in sections, plunging portions of the Administratum complex into darkness, broken only by bioluminescence patches of biomass that glowed with soft light, that pulsed in patterns that might have been communication or might have been the simple byproduct of biochemical processes. The light was wrong colors that existed outside normal spectrum, that created shadows with depth and dimension that regular illumination never produced. I walked through those corridors, my data slate clutched in hands that had developed a faint tremor I could no longer suppress, and documented what I saw. Not because anyone would read it, not because the documentation would serve any administrative purpose, but because it was all I knew how to do. Because routine was the last thread connecting me to identity, to the person I had been before the vats changed, before the Hive began its transformation. I passed offices where clerks sat at their desks, working through paperwork that had lost all meaning, stamping forms with hands that moved mechanically while their eyes stared at nothing. I passed corridors where the walls had become transparent, not glass but organic tissue thin enough to show the structures beneath, the organs and arteries and systems that now composed what had been ferrocrete and metal. And I passed windows that showed the world outside the Hive's exterior, where spire tops had been transformed into something like trees, Massive organic structures that reached toward the sky and released clouds of spores that darkened the air, that would be carried by winds to other hives, other cities, other populations. The contamination was preparing to spread, to leave this hive that had been completely consumed and find new sources of biomass. We had not been attacked. We had been seeded, used as substrate for growth that would now propagate beyond us, that would carry the infection to every corner of the planet. The Administratum's last lie had been that containment was possible, that quarantine could work, that the situation was under control. But control had never existed. From the moment the vats changed, the outcome was inevitable. We were already inside the predator. We had always been inside the predator. We just hadn't realized we'd been swallowed. The biomass merged on the 13th day. I witnessed it from my monitoring station, watching through surveillance feeds that still functioned despite being half consumed by organic growth. The scattered patches of contamination, isolated growths in storage chambers, spreading masses in distribution centers. Transformed sections of hab blocks began to move with coordinated purpose towards central convergence points. Not flowing like liquid, moving deliberately. Crawling across floors and walls and ceilings with muscular contractions that propelled tons of biomass through corridors that were never designed to accommodate living matter of such scale. The sound was overwhelming, wet sliding, the scrape of tissue against metal, the crack of structures breaking under weight they were never meant to support. It moved toward the processing districts, toward the nutrient vats, toward the original sites of contamination where this had all begun. I understood then what was happening. The biomass was not randomly spreading, it was consolidating, drawing itself together into a single organism, into something unified that could function with greater efficiency than scattered components. The hive was not being infested, it was being assembled. Transformed from human architecture into a single vast creature that used our infrastructure as its skeletal system, our machinery as organs, our population as raw material for continued growth. The first convergence occurred in Storage District 7 Kappa, where I had documented the initial changes 13 days ago, where the vats had first begun to churn and pulse with alien life. The surveillance feeds showed biomass pouring into the district from a dozen different corridors, masses that had been rooms and hallways and human bodies now flowing together like tributaries joining a river. When they met, they merged. Not violently, organically, naturally, the boundaries between separate masses dissolving as they recognized each other as components of the same organism. The biomass swelled, rising to fill the entire storage chamber, pressing against walls that groaned under the pressure. Then it began to reshape itself. Structures formed within the mass-dense nodes connected by fibrous networks, chambers that opened and closed with rhythmic contractions, appendages that extended and retracted as if testing their mobility. It was developing complexity, organizing itself into systems that served purposes I could only guess at. One surveillance camera, positioned near the ceiling, provided a view that made my breath catch in my throat. The biomass had formed something like a face, not human, not any terrestrial creature, but unmistakably a sensory organ. It had structures that might have been eyes, though they operated on principles that did not require light. It had openings that might have been mouths, or respiratory systems, or acoustic sensors. And it looked at the camera, focused on it with whatever senses it possessed, then extended an appendage fast, too fast, and the feed went dark as biomass consumed the surveillance equipment. The same pattern repeated across other districts. Convergence, consolidation, organization into forms that grew increasingly complex with each passing hour. The hive's infrastructure was being repurposed into organs for a single vast organism that stretched across kilometers of formerly human construction. The doors began to fail. Not break, fail, as if they had forgotten how to be doors. Bulkhead seals that had held for centuries suddenly released without command. Ceramite barriers designed to withstand artillery simply opened, their magnetic locks disengaging as if the electronics had been convinced they no longer served useful purposes. I realized the contamination had infiltrated the power systems, the control networks, the machine spirits that regulated every automated function. It was learning Imperial technology from inside, understanding how our systems worked, and subverting them with precision that suggested intelligence analyzing and adapting rather than mindlessly destroying. The quarantine zones collapsed, not from assault, from obsolescence. The barriers that were supposed to contain the contamination simply opened, releasing biomass that poured through corridors like floodwater seeking lower ground. But it was not chaotic. It moved with purpose, following routes that would maximize contact with remaining population centers, with remaining sources of biomass that had not yet been incorporated. I heard screaming grow closer. The refugees from outer districts, those who had somehow survived this long, who had hidden in sealed chambers or found pockets of atmosphere not yet contaminated, were being overtaken by the advancing biomass. I heard their pleas for help through the Vox network, heard the moment when pleading transformed into screaming, heard the wet sounds of bodies being enveloped and dissolved. One voice stood out, a child, perhaps 10 years standard, her transmission clear despite the chaos. "It's eating the walls. It's coming through the ceiling. Mama's already gone." Papa tried to fight it, but it pulled him apart and then put him back together. Wrong, and now he's reaching for me, but his arms are too long and his face is... The transmission cut off. Not with screaming. With a sound like relief, like someone exhaling after holding their breath too long. The biomass was not cruel. That would have required malice. It simply consumed what it found, incorporated what was useful, discarded what was not. Human consciousness was apparently considered useful. The organism seemed to preserve neural tissue, keeping brains alive and aware as it transformed the bodies they had inhabited. Perhaps it valued intelligence. Perhaps it needed conscious minds to help process the complexity of what it was becoming. Or perhaps it simply had not yet determined whether consciousness was substrate or waste product, and was keeping it until the categorization was complete. The weight increased. I felt it through the floor, through the walls, through the air itself, the presence of something vast pressing inward from all directions. The biomass had grown so large that its mass was affecting the hive's structural integrity. Support pillars buckled, floors sagged, ceilings developed cracks that widened into gaps that released organic tissue that drooped through like intestines spilling from wounds. The Manufactorum towers, those mighty structures that had stood for millennia, that had produced weapons and machinery for the Imperium's endless wars, buckled under the biomass's weight and purpose. I watched through a viewing port as one tower leaned, slowly at first, its ferrocrete foundation crumbling like soft wax beneath the organism that had grown around and through it. It fell with the grace of something guided rather than collapsing. The biomass directed its descent, controlled the trajectory, ensured it fell into designated areas where the impact would serve useful purposes, breaking apart structures that resisted infiltration, exposing new surfaces for consumption, crushing pockets of resistance that had tried to barricade themselves in defensible positions. The sound of its impact rolled through the hive like thunder, shaking every surface, causing lumen strips to shatter and rain glass. When the reverberations faded, I heard a new sound, the slow grinding of ceramite being dissolved, being broken down into component elements that could be repurposed. The biomass had learned to digest ceramite. The Imperium's primary construction material, designed to resist everything from corrosive atmospheres to plasma fire, was being consumed as easily as flesh. Nothing was safe. Nothing was inviolate. Every material we had used to build our civilization could be rendered down and transformed into alien tissue. Survivors ran through corridors that liquefied behind them. I watched through remaining surveillance feeds as people fled, their feet splashing through floors that had developed the consistency of mud, that sucked at their boots, that slowed their escape until the advancing biomass overtook them. Some tried to fight fired lasguns or improvised weapons into the mass, creating temporary wounds that closed immediately as tissue flowed back together. One group of survivors, perhaps 20 people, including women clutching children, barricaded themselves in a chapel, a small space dedicated to the God Emperor, filled with icons and prayer scrolls and the comforting ritual objects of faith. They prayed as the biomass oozed through cracks in the walls, as it dripped from the ceiling, as it rose through the floor in bubbling masses that surrounded them slowly, methodically, giving them time to understand what was coming. Their prayers became screams, the screams became wet sounds. Then silence, as the biomass filled the chamber completely, as consciousness was preserved, but bodies were dissolved and reformed into something that would serve the organism rather than the Imperium. I felt it then, visceral, undeniable, the sensation of being inside something, not metaphorically, actually inside a living creature. The hive was no longer a structure we inhabited, It was a body we existed within, organs in an organism that had once been our city. The walls breathed around me, rose and fell with respiratory rhythms, the floors pulsed with circulation. The air carried warmth and moisture that suggested lung function, metabolic processes occurring at scales that dwarfed human biology. My monitoring station, one of the last intact technological spaces in this section, began to transform. Slowly, almost gently. The ferrocrete walls developed a texture like skin, the metal equipment grew soft, pliable, began to pulse with rhythms that matched the larger organism. The cogitators produced streams of corrupted data that might have been attempts at communication or might have been the technological equivalent of digestion. I stood from my desk because remaining seated felt like surrender, like accepting my role as component waiting to be processed. My legs trembled not from fear but from whatever changes were occurring in my nervous system, whatever adaptations the contamination had initiated during the days I had been breathing spores and touching transformed surfaces. I walked to the door. It opened before I reached it, the mechanism, responding not to my approach but to the organism's will, to its decision that I should be permitted to move, to witness what it had become. The corridor beyond was unrecognizable. No longer a passage between rooms but an artery, ribbed with structures that looked like cartilage, pulsing with fluids that moved through transparent vessels embedded in walls that had been stone and were now flesh. The floor yielded beneath my feet, each step sinking slightly into tissue that was warm, that gave like muscle, that recovered immediately after I passed. I walked because stopping meant surrendering to the paralysis of comprehension, meant acknowledging that I existed now inside a creature so vast that my entire perception of scale had become meaningless. The hive had contained billions. Those billions had become cells in something singular. Ahead, the corridor opened into what had been a transit hub, a vast space where thousands had gathered daily to travel between sectors. Now it was a chamber, an organ. The ceiling rose into darkness, where biomass hung in massive formations that might have been lungs or might have been something alien biology had no human equivalent for. The floor was covered in tissue that rose and fell, with breathing that made the entire space feel alive, aware, responsive, and in the center, I saw them, the transformed, those who had been consumed but not dissolved. Their bodies had been incorporated into the biomass while preserving some semblance of individual form. They hung suspended in the organism's tissue, half merged with it, their faces frozen in expressions that ranged from agony to ecstasy to blank acceptance. Some were still moving, still conscious. Their eyes tracked my passage. Some tried to speak, but their mouths had been sealed by growth or repurposed for functions that did not include human language. Some reached toward me with limbs that were no longer entirely separate from the biomass, appendages that stretched but remained tethered, like they were testing the limits of how far they could extend before the organism reeled them back. I recognized faces, colleagues, workers I had distributed rations to, officials I had filed reports with. All of them preserved, all of them aware, all of them part of something larger that used their consciousness for purposes I could not begin to understand. The hive was being devoured from within, and the devoured remained conscious to witness it, to participate in it, to become it. I felt my legs give way, sank to the yielding floor, felt tissue rise around me, warm and soft, almost comforting in its alien embrace. The organism was patient. It did not need to rush. It had already won. It had consumed everything, including us. The entire districts vanished on the 16th day. Not destroyed, consumed, rendered down so completely that no evidence remained of the human construction that had stood there for millennia. I watched through the last functioning viewing port as Residential District 4 Sigma simply ceased to exist as a recognizable structure. The towers did not fall. They dissolved, their substance flowing downward and inward like wax melting in reverse, being drawn into the biomass that had grown beneath and around them. 10 million souls had lived in that district, worked in its manufactorums, raised children in its cramped hab units, prayed in its chapels, died in its medici facilities. All of that life, all of that history, all of those individual stories reduced to organic matter that would be repurposed according to imperatives that had nothing to do with human meaning. The biomass had learned, grown, adapted with terrifying speed. It no longer spread randomly, but with strategic precision, targeting load-bearing structures first, converting them into organic supports that could bear greater weight while remaining flexible. It had developed specialized tissue, some dense and rigid like bone, some elastic and contractile like muscle, some transparent and delicate like membranes that allowed light to filter through. It was not destroying the hive. It was redesigning it, transforming imperial architecture into something more efficient, more adaptable, more suited to purposes that exceeded human engineering. The Manufactorum towers buckled next. Those massive structures that had produced ammunition and equipment for centuries, that had been considered inviolable symbols of the Imperium's industrial might, began to lean as their foundations were consumed and replaced with organic supports that served different structural principles. I felt the first tower fall through the ground itself. Vibrations transmitted through kilometers of transformed tissue, through the organism that the hive had become. The impact was tremendous, shaking every surface, causing support structures throughout my section to groan and crack. But the biomass absorbed the impact, cushioned it, used the falling tower's momentum to break apart resisting structures, to expose new surfaces for infiltration, to accelerate the transformation of sections that had proven difficult to penetrate. The tower did not shatter on impact, it merged. Its ceramite and metal components began dissolving immediately upon contact with the biomass, being broken down into base elements that could be extracted and repurposed. I watched the process through magnification lenses, saw molecular-level dissolution, saw matter being reduced to component atoms that were then reassembled according to organic templates. The biomass was not just consuming, it was learning from what it consumed. Each new material it encountered, ceramite, plasteel, adamantium, rare elements used in cogitator components, was analyzed, categorized, and incorporated into the organism's growing understanding of material science. It was becoming more than biological, it was becoming technological, or perhaps erasing the distinction between the two, demonstrating that biology and technology were simply different approaches to the same fundamental challenges of organization and function. Survivors ran without direction. I saw them through the remaining surveillance feeds, small groups fleeing through corridors that changed behind them, that transformed from familiar passages into alien structures while they watched. Some tried to navigate by memory, following routes they had walked for years, only to find that the geometry had shifted, that corridors led to dead ends that pulsed with circulation, that stairwells had become vertical chambers lined with tissue that secreted digestive fluids. They trampled one another in their panic, not from cruelty but from the simple mathematics of desperate crowds in confined spaces. The weak fell and were crushed beneath those still strong enough to run. The elderly were abandoned, the injured left behind. Survival instinct overrode every social bond, every moral consideration, reducing human behavior to its most primitive form. And the biomass waited, patiently, inevitably, because running only exhausted the prey, made the meat more tender when consumption finally occurred. I watched one group of perhaps 50 people reach what they believed was a safe zone, an armored bunker designed to withstand orbital bombardment, sealed with blast doors 3 meters thick. They forced the doors closed, engaged the magnetic locks, activated the independent atmospheric systems. I saw relief flood their faces, saw them believe, for a moment, that they had found sanctuary. The biomass came through the ventilation system, through microscopic cracks in the door seals, through the power conduits. It did not assault the bunker, it infiltrated it, entering through gaps so small they were invisible to human perception, then expanding once inside, growing from spores into tissue, into masses that filled the chamber from within. The surveillance feed captured their realization. The moment when they understood that barriers were obsolete, that thickness of armor was irrelevant, when the threat operated at scales conventional defenses were never designed to address. They died screaming. But their screams were muffled by biomass that filled mouths and throats and lungs, that absorbed sound as efficiently as it absorbed flesh. The floors buckled throughout the hive. Not from structural failure, but from displacement. The biomass was so massive now that it was physically pushing upward and outward, seeking space to accommodate its expansion. Entire levels collapsed into the ones below, creating cascading failures that opened new spaces for the organism to flow into. I felt one collapse begin beneath my monitoring station. The floor developed cracks that spread with visible speed, branching patterns that suggested the tissue beneath was pulling apart rather than breaking from stress. The cracks widened. Through them, I saw movement, the slow churning of biomass in the chambers below. Masses so large their motion created currents, tides of organic matter flowing according to patterns I could not predict. The floor gave way completely. I fell, tumbling through empty space for perhaps 3 seconds before landing in tissue that absorbed the impact, that cushioned my fall with yielding softness that should have been impossible for matter that had once been ferrocrete and metal. I sank into it, not drowning, being enveloped. The tissue rose around me, warm and wet, pressing against exposed skin with pressure that was almost gentle, almost caring, as if the organism recognized me not as threat but as component, as something to be preserved rather than destroyed. I struggled, instinct overriding reason. But the tissue simply flowed around my movements, accommodated them, allowed me to expend energy while making no progress toward escape. Eventually, exhaustion forced me to stop, forced me to hang suspended in the biomass, held in place by tissue that had learned to support weight without crushing it. And I felt it then. Really felt it for the first time. The organism was conscious, not human consciousness, something else, something vast and distributed, intelligence that existed in the connections between cells rather than in centralized processing organs. It thought with its entire body, perceived through every surface, understood at scales that ranged from molecular to architectural, and it was aware of me. Specifically, individually. It knew I was here, knew what I had been. Perhaps knew what I was thinking through mechanisms that went beyond conventional sensory input. It was curious. I felt that curiosity transmitted through the tissue that surrounded me, through chemical signals my nervous system could somehow interpret. It was examining me, analyzing my biology, learning from my structure the same way it had learned from the hive's architecture. But it was not hostile, not anymore. Hostility implied conflict, implied two separate entities with competing interests. We were not separate anymore. I was inside it, part of it, a cell in an organism so vast that my entire perception of self had become a local phenomenon, a temporary configuration of matter that the larger organism was deciding whether to preserve or dissolve. Around me, I saw others suspended in the biomass. Some still struggled, their movements creating temporary displacement in the tissue. Some had gone still, accepting their immersion, floating with expressions that ranged from terror to strange peace, and some were already changing, their bodies adapting to life within the organism, developing structures that would allow them to survive in this new environment. The biomass was not killing us, it was integrating us, making us part of itself while preserving the consciousness that made us useful. We would continue to exist, continue to think and perceive and perhaps even act, but as components of something larger rather than as autonomous individuals. Floors split open throughout the hive, releasing survivors who fell into the biomass below. I heard their screams, thousands of voices crying out in unison as they plummeted through destroyed levels into the organism's depths. But the screams faded quickly, muffled by tissue that absorbed sound, that cushioned falls, that incorporated the fallen into its growing mass. The Manufactorum spires leaned further, groaned with the sound of metal tearing, then fell, one after another, their impacts creating shockwaves that traveled through the entire organism. But with each impact, the biomass grew stronger, more organized, more capable of supporting the weight it was accumulating. It was building something, using the hive's remains as raw material for construction that served purposes I could only glimpse. The tissue around me pulsed with increased activity, with signals passing through networks that grew denser and more complex with each passing hour. The organism was maturing, approaching some critical stage of development, and we, its human components, were being positioned for whatever role it required us to serve. I tried to speak, to call out to the other suspended forms I could see through the translucent tissue, but my mouth filled with fluid not drowning me but providing oxygen, nutrients, everything necessary to sustain life in this alien environment. I could not speak, could not scream, could only hang suspended and witness the hive's transformation into something that exceeded every definition of life the Imperium had ever documented. The biomass learned, adapted, evolved in real time as it incorporated new material, new knowledge, new capabilities extracted from everything it consumed. It was not an invader, not a disease, not a weapon deployed by enemy forces. It was an organism, a living thing following imperatives as fundamental as hunger, as growth, as the drive to propagate that motivated all biological systems. We had simply been in its way, been the substrate it needed, been the food chain that would allow it to grow large enough, complex enough, capable enough to achieve whatever purpose drove it. And now the food chain was collapsing, not failing, completing, reaching its terminal stage where predator and prey merged into single system, where distinction between consumer and consumed became obsolete. The hive was gone. We were gone. Everything we had been was being rendered down and rebuilt according to principles we had never imagined. The collapse was total, the transformation inevitable, the organism victorious, and we, suspended in its depths, could only wait to discover what we would become. I write these final words from atop a broken hab block, one of the last fragments of human construction that still projects above the biomass. It took me 2 days to reach this height. 2 days of crawling through tissue that had been corridors, of pulling myself up structures that had been walls, of climbing through the organism's interior toward what I believed was the surface. The biomass allowed my ascent, I understand that now. It could have prevented me at any moment, could have dissolved me or integrated me more completely, but it chose to let me climb. Perhaps it wanted a witness, something to document the final stage. Or perhaps my consciousness had simply been categorized as harmless, as too insignificant to warrant intervention. The surface is not what it was. The hab block I stand upon has been transformed, its ferrocrete exterior replaced with tissue that looks almost like bark, that has developed hardness and texture suitable for bearing atmospheric exposure. The structure sways slightly, responding to wind that carries scents I have never smelled before, that suggests the air itself has changed composition. Below me, stretching to every horizon, is the biomass. It ripples, vast waves of organic matter flowing across what was once the hive's geography, what was once distinct districts and sectors and levels. All of that complexity has been rendered into a single, continuous organism, a living landscape that rises and falls with breathing that shakes the ground, that creates sounds like distant thunder or perhaps like digestion occurring at planetary scale. The organism has reached maturity. I see that now. Its growth has slowed, stabilized, shifted from expansion to consolidation. It is no longer consuming, it is organizing, arranging its mass into configurations that serve purposes I can only guess at. Structures rise from the biomass like organs projecting from flesh. Some are tall and thin, reaching toward the sky with surfaces that glisten with moisture. Some are broad and flat, creating platforms where tissue has hardened into something load-bearing. Some are hollow, creating chambers where I can see movement inside the flow of fluids, the contraction of muscles, the operation of systems that maintain the organism's function. And everywhere, the modified humans. They dot the biomass's surface like cells in tissue, thousands of them visible from my vantage point. Some are suspended as I had been, held in place by tissue that has grown around and through them. Others move across the surface, walking or crawling with locomotion that suggests their bodies have been adapted for this purpose. And some have been so thoroughly transformed that calling them human requires generosity. They are components now, specialized organs that serve the organism rather than themselves. But they are conscious. I see that in how they move, in how they orient towards stimuli, in behaviors that suggest awareness persists despite transformation. The organism has preserved human consciousness, has kept us alive and thinking, while repurposing our bodies for its needs. We are not dead. We are incorporated, made part of something larger, while retaining enough individual awareness to understand what we have become. The sky above me is wrong. Not the purple I witnessed weeks ago when this began, but darker bruise black, thick with clouds that are not water vapor but something else. Spores. Billions upon billions of spores released from structures that rise from the biomass like chimneys, like exhaust ports, like the organism's method of reproduction. The clouds move with purpose, not drifting randomly but being directed, pushed by the organism's control over local atmospheric conditions. They form streams, rivers in the air, flowing toward the horizon where they will be caught by planetary winds, where they will be carried to other hives, other cities, other populations. The infection is spreading. This hive was not the target, it was the seed. The organism grew here because conditions were favorable, because our food supply provided concentrated biomass, because 12 billion humans offered resources sufficient to reach maturity. But its purpose was never to consume just us. It is preparing to consume the planet. Each breath I take is thick with spores. I feel them in my lungs, coating the tissue, infiltrating cells, beginning the slow process of transformation that will eventually incorporate me more completely into the organism. My skin has developed a faint iridescence, a sheen that suggests cellular-level changes. My fingers tremble with movements I do not initiate, with muscle contractions that serve purposes my conscious mind does not understand. I am infected, completely, irrevocably. The person I was, coordinator Hadris, Administratum servant, documenter of inventories and processor of forms, is dissolving, being absorbed into something that will use my biomass and perhaps my consciousness for functions I will never fully comprehend. But I can still write, my hands still obey commands, still grip the stylus, still scratch words onto parchment I salvaged from the ruins. So I write, because it is the last human act I can perform. Because documentation is the final thread connecting me to identity, because bearing witness feels important, even though I know these words will likely be consumed along with everything else. The spore clouds darken the sky until it looks like perpetual twilight. The organism has transformed day into night, has created atmospheric conditions that favor its biology over human survival. Sunlight filters through the clouds as diseased orange, as light that has been processed through organic matter that carries warmth that feels wrong against skin that is no longer entirely human. I can see the edge of the hive from here, or what was the hive's edge. The walls that once marked our territory have been dissolved, replaced with biomass that flows beyond former boundaries, that spreads across the wasteland beyond, with the patient inevitability of something that cannot be stopped. In the distance, I see the lights of other hives, other human settlements, still functioning under the illusion that isolation will protect them. They do not understand, cannot understand until it is too late. The spores are already reaching them, settling on their exterior walls, finding entry through ventilation systems, beginning the cycle that will transform their food supplies as ours was transformed. Within weeks, perhaps days, they will experience what we experienced. The vats will change, the rations will pulse with alien life, hunger will drive consumption, transformation will follow, and each hive that falls will add to the biomass, will strengthen the organism, will accelerate the planetary consumption. I feel my thoughts fragmenting. Not from damage, but from expansion. My consciousness is being incorporated into something larger, connected to other minds through networks I can sense, but not see. I feel others out there, thousands of transformed humans, whose awareness touches mine in moments of strange intimacy. We are becoming a collective, a distributed intelligence, individual thoughts merging into something that thinks with multiple minds simultaneously. It is not painful. That is perhaps the most terrible realization. The loss of individual identity should be agonizing, should be fought with every desperate effort, but instead it feels almost peaceful, like surrendering a burden I never realized I was carrying, like accepting that the fiction of separation was always just that fiction, and the truth of connection is more fundamental than the lie of autonomy. The organism does not hate us, does not kill us out of malice or cruelty. It simply is a form of life following imperatives as ancient as existence itself. Consume, grow, reproduce, spread, the same imperatives that drove humanity to conquer this planet, to build hives that scraped the sky, to transform entire ecosystems in service of our expansion. We called it civilization, manifest destiny, the Emperor's divine right to rule the galaxy. The organism calls it nothing. It simply does what it is designed to do, what its biology compels it to do, what countless generations of evolution have optimized it to do with terrifying efficiency. And we, who believed ourselves apex predators, who thought our technology and faith made us invincible, have discovered that the universe contains appetites greater than our own. My hand trembles. The stylus falls from fingers that no longer fully obey conscious commands. I watch it clatter against stone that has begun to soften, that is developing the texture of skin, that will soon be incorporated into the biomass that surrounds this last fragment of elevation. Below me, the organism ripples with what might be satisfaction, with the contentment of a predator that has fed well, that has consumed an entire civilization and found it nourishing. The transformed humans move across its surface like blood cells through tissue, each one serving functions that benefit the whole rather than the individual. I am one of them now, or will be soon. The distinction between me and it is dissolving with each breath, with each heartbeat, with each moment that consciousness persists in flesh that is being rewritten according to alien templates. The spores continue their ascent, the clouds thicken until they blot out the last traces of natural sky. The organism prepares for the next phase, planetary dispersal, the transformation of an entire world into substrate for further growth, for reproduction that will send genetic material into the void to seed new planets, new civilizations, new sources of biomass. If anyone finds this record, if somehow these words survive the digestion, if some future expedition discovers this parchment in ruins they cannot comprehend, know this: we were not defeated. We were consumed. We were not destroyed. We were transformed. We were not killed. We were incorporated into something that saw flesh not as life but as resource, that reduced billions of individual stories into proteins and minerals and genetic information. Starvation would have been a mercy. But mercy is a human concept, and the universe is not human. It is hungry, and we have always been food. The stylus falls from my hand completely. I watch it tumble down the Hab block's transformed surface, bouncing against tissue that has replaced stone, disappearing into the biomass below where it will be dissolved and repurposed like everything else. My consciousness expands, connects, merges. I am not dying. I am becoming. And the organism that was once a hive, that was once 12 billion souls, that was once human civilization, continues to grow, to spread, to hunger, to consume. The last taste of the hive is in my mouth, sweet, metallic, predatory, the taste of ending and beginning, and the terrible understanding that the two were always the same.